I just completed Act 3 on my Stormweaver reroll, and it was not only way faster than the Warrior, but also way easier than I was expecting. So, I'm going to talk about it, because the campaign took me 13.5 hours, then about 30 minutes afterwards to do my second Ascendancy, because I kind of forgot about that in Act 3. I was like, oh, I'll do that when I'm a little over leveled, it's probably going to be tough. Then, of course, there was always one more zone to clear, and one more zone to clear. Got to the end of Act 3, realized, oh yeah, I was supposed to go back and do that Ascendancy. Also, I only died 30 times in Act 1 to 3, which your mileage may vary. You may die more than me, you may die less than me, but I'm pretty happy with that. So, I'm going to go over my leveling journey, covering Acts 1 through 3, including some of the mistakes I made along the way in the early game, talk about the skill and gem setups I was using, and talk about some of the gear choices I made, before going on to where all of my gear is, which originally was the very end of Act 3, but kind of turned into the very start of Act 1 Cruel, because Path of Exile is really fun and I just had to do a couple more zones. And so, without further ado, let's get into it. Starting with Act 1, where I made a lot of mistakes. Because I was trying to force Ember Fusillade. This looked really good, it has big numbers on it. And the thing is, it did excellent single target damage that made fights like the Executioner, which you are seeing right now, completely trivial. Geonor was also a pretty easy fight. But here's the thing. It is only single target. So I was really struggling when it came to clear. Now for part of this, I tried augmenting it with a Gleed Staff and using the staff skill, Frozen Shards. Very good at freezing enemies. Pretty good on single target as well. Not so good in clear. And when you stand close to a boss, yes, it does look like all of the projectiles overlap, and they all deal damage. I was also dropping quite a few frost bombs, usually on the tankier enemies, both because that way, if the enemy gets frozen, it doesn't fight, and also frost bomb hits pretty hard. So, as you can tell, I've talked about the word single target 3 times. In big open areas, wasn't too big of a deal, I could kind of single target stuff down. Wasn't the fastest, wasn't the slowest. But then I got to the Freythorn, and the twisted corridors of Count Geonor's Manor, and I was just constantly getting swarmed. I wasn't quite dying, but it was getting very, very close. So I feel like my setup in Act 1 was not very good. But there is a setup that is very, very good that would especially excel in those enclosed areas. And that is Spark Flamewall. So I think the best way to play Act 1 is to focus on Spark and Flamewall. Drop a Flamewall, then fire sparks through it. Use your Frost Bomb for extra burst damage, and if you find a good Gleed Staff, you should be able to use that to augment your single target. Just swap some damage gems in out of your Spark. You can still fire it through a Flame Wall for additional DPS. This way you have the best of both worlds. Once you get to Count Geonor's Manor, toss in a Cold Snap, because this way you can consume the freeze on rares and bosses for even more single target damage. Now when it comes to gear in Act 1, I honestly don't think it matters too much in terms of base types. But try to get movement speed on your boots, and try to get some resistances, try to get some life. In addition, for your weapon, this is the one place where stats and base type matter. If you want to use freezing shards, you need a Gleed Staff. Otherwise, look for something with plus to level of all spells, plus to level of fire spells, or plus to level of lightning spells. This way, you should have the most damage possible going into Act 2. So, for Act 1, recommended gems, Spark linked with Pierce, and then Unleash or Controlled Destruction. Unleash will let you fire multiple sparks as long as you're not chain casting. Controlled Destruction is more consistent DPS. If you're doing single target, you use both Unleashed and Controlled and drop the Pierce. Flame Wall linked to either Spell Cascade or Fortress. Spell Cascade means you kind of can't miss. Fortress means you create a ring, you stand in the ring, and you can't miss. You will always fire your projectiles through it. On the other hand, if you're using Frost Bomb for damage, go Spell Cascade here. You can drop it slightly off center on enemies, so 2 of the explosions overlap. Or you can increase the area of effect for more utility, making it easier to damage and debuff enemies. Then on Cold Snap, if you're not using Controlled Destruction elsewhere, feel free to toss it in. Or you can put on Conk Effect, boosting the damage and costing some AoE that doesn't really matter too much on that skill. Now moving into Act 2, I quickly started leaning into the Spark Flamewall combo, and it ended up being really smooth. I also took a liking to Spell Cascade on my Frostbomb. I hadn't been using it much in Act 1, but I was using it a lot in Act 2. It wasn't quite as safe as, say, using freezing shards to freeze an enemy from a distance, but it did a lot more clear than freezing shards would, as even with Pierce, they didn't do too well against a bunch of enemies that are running at me. Instead, freezing shards is much better for single target and bosses. But Spark bounces around. In a narrow corridor, you're going to absolutely fill it with Spark projectiles, and they are all going to be empowered by the Flame Wall, which feels awesome, and it completely tears through packs with Pierce support. Now, after ascending and becoming a Stormweaver, your Frost Bomb is even more potent. It removes 40% of the cold resistance from an enemy. So an enemy has 40% res, now they have 0. If they had 0 before, now they have negative 40. This is really strong, and it's a great way to magnify other damaging cold skills. Because this is so strong, and because I knew in Act 3 I was going to be playing cold, I started taking cold damage nodes on the tree, which did not help my Spark, and it did not help my Flame Wall. But with a +2 spell skills weapon, I felt like my damage was in an okay place for Act 2, and I would rather focus on something that boosted my future DPS without having to spend the gold to respec later. Also, a lot of the points fit into a weapon set, so you don't even have to respec. Just put excess points outside of your weapon set into cold stuff rather than fire or lightning. Now, Act 2 has the Dreadnought, a zone full of twisty corridors, and plenty of Faradun fighters. On my warrior, I died half a dozen times here, and I really struggled to reach each of the zone's checkpoints. On my Sork, I didn't die once, and I am really proud of that. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying, oh, the zone was super easy, you won't die either. No, it was actually pretty hard. I had to pay very close attention, always drop my Frost Bomb ahead, try to get overlaps then when stuff was frozen, Flame Wall, and Spark. But I played well, and I'm proud of it, so I wanted to share that. Then I capped out the very successful run through the Dreadnought by pretty much face-tanking everything on the boss, but I had a pretty decent amount of res. I had looked out for some resistance rings, and so I was actually able to tank a surprising amount on the boss. Yeah, I did it in one try. I was kind of like, I'm getting hit a lot. If I die here, I'll just try again and play more carefully. I killed the boss. It worked out. In terms of the rest of my gear, I honestly didn't pay much attention beyond the resistance rings. So, for Act 2, Spark, Pierce, Unleash. That's what felt best to me. Flame Wall with Fortress and Arcane Tempo, that way I could cast it just a little bit faster, and I very much liked the Ring playstyle. Then Frost Bomb with Spell Cascade and Controlled Destruction, which turned it into a potent nuke, as you could overlap the explosions. Cold Snap, Conk Effect. Really only used it occasionally, though. And, if you are lucky, you can get a cast on Freeze Gem at the very end of Act 2. It's going to be a random Spirit Gem drop. You're probably not going to get it, but if you do, stick your Cold Snap with Conk Effect into the cast on Freeze. This way, it'll trigger automatically. Just be aware, if you do that, it is going to automatically unfreeze bosses, which might be undesirable, so maybe take it off on boss fights if you're struggling. Now for Act 3, I was really worried, because this is where my warrior struggled. But this is also where the Sorceress has a lot of huge power spikes. First being Cast on Freeze. If it didn't drop at the end of Act 2, it's going to drop here. And the upside for Cast on Freeze is again that big burst damage. It'll obliterate any normal enemy that gets frozen. It'll obliterate most rares that get frozen. This is also where I swapped off of Flame Wall and Spark after getting the Cast on Freeze, because in addition to Cast on Freeze, I also got Frost Wall. This creates walls that I could use to body block enemies, preventing melee fighters from even reaching me. And when a large enemy or boss comes in contact with a wall, it automatically explodes. Combine this with Spell Cascade, and it does incredible damage. I don't know that it's so broken it's guaranteed to be hotfixed, but it's possible it's going to get a balance adjustment in the future. If a wall doesn't break by default, though, you're going to need to break it with a Frost Bomb, which can be a little bit tricky. Again, try to aim it so it overlaps on some of your wall segments right around the enemy. So that's what I did for most of Act 3, and it went pretty well. I died occasionally, but overall it was much, much smoother than my experience with Warrior. I did have a pretty good Gleed staff with +3 to cold skills, and so I was firing that ahead, waiting for enemies to get frozen, and using Frost Bomb on anything that happened to survive the initial cold snaps. Plus, of course, dropping walls anytime foes tried to swarm me. Now, at the end of Act 3, Comet unlocks, and this feels awesome. To use Comet and Cast on Freeze, you need an 8% energy generation node on your tree, and an uncut level 2 support to make into Impetus. So I strongly recommend cutting Impetus, the 40% energy generation support, for the first level 2 support that you get. But once you do, an enemy freezes, Comet triggers, and the enemy is reduced to a fine icy powder. Combine this with Frostwall's ability to obliterate bosses, and yeah, it feels absolutely great. It feels almost like playing an endgame build in the campaign, except for the fact that you don't really have endgame build defenses. Now, as a note, all of this is heavily reliant on a Gleed staff, but if you don't happen to find one, ZenM has been running Frostbolt with Glaciation support as an alternative free source, and that's been working very well for him. Though you can definitely do that instead if you don't happen to find a staff. During Act 3, I kind of came to a realization about gear. Instead of looking for gear that had good bases and good stats, and then regaling and exalting, for the most part, I looked for gear with sockets that I could roll okay stats on. Sockets plus life, and I could use the sockets to force resistances. Doing this, I had about 800, 900-ish life by the end of Act 3, and I was not resistance capped, but at like 40-ish to 75%, depending on the exact resistance, minus, of course, chaos that doesn't seem too common and wasn't a pressing concern to me. And as for fizz damage, I mean, if I got hit by a big slam, I'd die, but if I walled off the enemies, they couldn't really melee me anyway. And then frozen solid, they weren't doing anything there either. I was trying a little bit of lightning warp. The shock ground provides 20% more damage, that's good, and culling just instantly takes something out of a fight. Problem is, you're also teleporting directly into enemies, so if they aren't frozen, you might get yourself melee to death. Maybe check back later on that one. As I keep playing through Cruel and as I get into the endgame, I'm going to experiment. Coffee BNS, Coffee Beans, another Maxwell member, has been experimenting with some pretty cool ball lightning tech. I might just yoink that and try it later and get back to you. So at the end of Act 3, I was using Freezing Shards with Pierce and Glaciation, Frost Bomb with Controlled Destruction and Magnified for Ink AoE, Cast on Freeze with Comet, Impetus, and Spell Echo. Spell Echo can easily be swapped for something like Controlled Destruction or Conk Effect. It's just a damage amplifier. You could also even use Spell Cascade on Comet for more AoE clear. Just keep in mind that Frostwall with Spell Cascade and Conk is a big old boss nuke. So you might want to swap the Spell Cascade back into your Frostwall on bosses, where Cast on Freeze Comet isn't going to be going off very often. In fact, Cast on Freeze isn't super useful for bosses, so you might even want to just hardcast Comet when the boss does get frozen. I wasn't doing it personally because I found them pretty easy, but it is something to think about if you're struggling, maybe because you didn't get a good staff. So now that I've talked about my experiences in Act 1 to 3, I'm going to go over how my character is right now. Again, very start of Act 1 Cruel. But this is far from a finished build, and I suspect I'm going to change more things as I play the game, see what I like, and see what I don't like. So if you want to know what this build becomes, do be sure to get subscribed and ring that notification bell to see when I upload in the future. First of all, my weapon. I got this from the vendor with +3 to level of all cold spell skills and one of the spell damage prefixes. Then I regaled it, and I was like, okay, well, that was a regal orb. I hit mana. Not good, not bad. Exalted it a few times, kept hitting things like spell damage, mana regen, intelligence, all useful stats. So I said, this weapon's going to last me a while. It is worth the exalts. With that said, if you're going on the trade site, you're buying and selling gear a lot, probably better to just buy something someone else found. So far, I've basically been playing this SSF. I'm going to start trading once I get to the end game, but I wanted to see how the campaign felt without relying on trade. This helmet was also from a vendor. It has life, so I clicked it because my res was already pretty decent. This ring I got in Act 2, and I absolutely should have been more aggressive about checking vendors and replaced it sooner. These gloves were floor trash that I also got in Act 2. They had fire res, and I needed the fire res because there's a lot of fire damage in Act 3. So I didn't replace them. I'm going to look for something, especially since Act 1 has more cold damage, and right now, I could probably gain a little bit of lightning and lose a little bit of fire and be totally fine. This belt, same thing, wanted to keep my fire res, gonna look to swap it out. These boots, they have no movement speed, which is unfortunate, but really good life and resistances, and hey, the armor is good against some incidental hits. But I'm gonna check the vendor and try to get movement speed. This ring's just bad. Again, it was really just for res. This amulet, pretty sick. It dropped with the 109 to max life. And then I regaled it. I got the energy shield. And then I kept slamming it. And I got some really good things like the mana regen. This build's pretty mana hungry, so I'm very happy with that. And some not so good things like the damage taken recouped. I don't have enough defenses for recoup to really matter right now. I'm kind of either just full or dead, but frozen enemies don't damage me, so it's not a problem. This chest piece, decent stats. When I regaled it, it hit the thorns damage, and I said, you know what? I can probably do better. So again, looking to replace it soon. I don't think any of my gear is particularly good, but it's functional. Now for skills, freezing shards with glaciation and pierce. This is to instantly freeze as many enemies as possible. The reason I haven't replaced it with a higher level staff is because right now it is functionally level 12, which is about what's starting to drop. So I'm going to try to fish around and get a +3 or maybe even +2 cold spell staff to replace this soon. Then Frostwall with concentrated effect and spell cascade. Again, this is the big single target nuke. Frost bomb with controlled destruction and strip away. This is something that I did after getting a spare level 2 support gem in Act 3. I don't think you should really prioritize this because strip away is a level 2, but it increases the effective exposure. So enemies go from -66 to very cold to -78, which is a significant damage bump. Then you have Flamewall, which you can use as a very small damage boost for freezing shards. The main reason that I'm keeping it around, though, is I kind of want to try doing a dual trigger setup when I get more spirit with cast on freeze and cast on ignite. And I want to see if ignites as though dealing 100 to 150 fire damage means it constantly just triggers cast on ignite. So I'll get back to you on that. Otherwise, feel free to drop it from your setup. It's not very important. Lightning Warp, currently using Unleash and Arcane Tempo. Unleash is kind of a pseudo flicker effect where you jump to a bunch of enemies. I think it's more of a meme than a good thing, but I wanted to try it. I'm probably going to be putting this somewhere else very soon. And Arcane Tempo, that's just what I was using right now. If anything, I'd really like to put Unleash in freezing shards, but I need a slightly higher level staff that has 3 sockets here, because you can't use a Jeweler's Orb on a weapon skill, sadly. Then last up, I did use my Jeweler's Orb for Cast on Freeze, for Comet, Spell Echo, and Impetus. This is the big old nuke trigger that is very much carrying the build. Now, here's my passive tree. And where I pathed early on was up here and over to exploit the elements. Because especially if you're igniting and shocking, it's really, really easy to get a bunch of elemental damage. Also, early game, I was taking Path of Storms and Path of Flame in a spare weapon set. That's how I said, build one for cold, build the other for lightning and stuff, and you just keep the weapon. You don't swap between them. You just keep the weapon in the set that is built out for the skills you're using. And then when you swap, you go to the other one. So I'm now using weapon set 1, which was my cold set. Weapon set 2 was my fire and lightning. I respect most of the nodes. I left a couple just because why spend the gold? I did also ultimately drop this because I really needed to rush over here to get the 8% gain increased energy. Then coming up, overexposure, really good damage boost, stripping away more of the enemy resistances. And then I rushed straight up to the top to get Endless Blizzard, Inescapable Cold, and Glaciation, which, yes, has the same name as the support. The penetration probably is not doing anything because penetration stops at 0. And if an enemy is getting -78% to its cold res, I can only imagine its cold res is in the negatives. But the increased exposure effect means whenever you drop Frostbomb, you're getting a big bonus. Then climate change for cold damage is extra fire against frozen enemies. This is why with Comet, you don't want to use Cold Snap to consume a freeze, so you can maximize all of those damage bonuses against frozen enemies. Over to Shattered Crystal for reduced ice crystal life to make it easier to break them. And then again, up here for the energy, that is super important, followed by Invocated Efficiency for mana recovery because Comet is very mana hungry. If you're wondering, why is this node here and this node here? What's going on? I forgot that I was supposed to click Thin Ice. This should be Thin Ice. I'm experimenting with some cast speed. Cast speed is good quality of life, but it doesn't directly increase the build's damage. So again, I'll get back to you on that in a future video as I play some more and see if it's worth losing the damage Right now, in Act 1 Cruel, it is absolutely worth it. I have tons of damage, and I'd rather the quality of life of casting things like the freezing shards faster. It just doesn't affect things like Comet, which, is a bulk of a build's damage. So that's what I've done so far. If you're wondering what I did for some of my story choices, like the Venom, did I choose between mana regen or stun threshold or ailment threshold? I didn't pick because I'm really bad at making decisions. I'll get back to you on that. I just want to see how much I get stunned later if I notice it as a problem, and also how bad the mana feels. And so that's everything that I've done up until this point. But going forward into Cruel and entering the endgame, what do I want to do and what do I want to look out for? First up, I want a new Gleed Staff, one with at least +2 to cold skills, though +2 to all would be even better. This way, I can get even more damage across the board and have a higher level freezing shards, because it's going to be bad if my freezing shards isn't instantly freezing enemies. Also, I'm pretty sure I'm getting right around the eye level bracket, where I should start getting 3 socket weapon skills, which will allow me to add another support, something like Unleash, for even more damage. Something else that I'm going to do is continue experimenting with my Ascendancy, because right now, I took Arcane Surge, and that's felt pretty good. It gives mana regen and cast speed. Again, very high quality of life. But it isn't raw damage, and also, I'm kind of curious what double chill might feel like. So I'm going to be experimenting a little bit with my Ascendancy in the near future, and see if I can really super slow enemies down to the point where, even if they are moving, I can just dodge everything they're trying to do. For gearing, I want to replace some of my blues, I want to get Spirit on my chest, and I want to start wearing some proper energy shield bases. This means I'm going to pick up all the bases I can, transmute, aug, if it gets something good, regal it, maybe slam it a couple times. Otherwise, rip. If I happen to find a good essence I can use, definitely toss that on. And I also want to get more trigger skills. Ideally, I think I want enough that I can have a full second trigger setup. I don't know if that's going to be another Comet, or if it's going to be a different skill like Eye of Winter. Eye of Winter with Flamewall could be pretty neat, as I think Flamewall counts as burning ground, so Eye of Winter will get a bunch of fire damage, though I am also nuking an enemy's cold resistance rather than fire resistance, so I'll have to figure out something there. I know Zen is using Elemental Invocation, which looks really nice, but I do want to see if the cast on Ignite stuff works. And worst case, if it doesn't work, well, Elemental Invocation it is. And so, with that said, that is my progress as of the end of Act 3 on my reroll. So far, I'm really enjoying the build. It feels very, very strong, and it feels super, super safe. But with that said, that is just my personal experiences. And so I'm curious about yours. If you're playing a similar build, has it been going well for you, or are you struggling? And if so, what do you have questions about? I might answer it down below, or that might be the topic of a future video. Now, with that said, if you want to see someone who's been pushing this build a lot farther, who's played it a lot more, then check out Zen M. He's also a member of Maxroll, and I'll link to his channel down in the description below. Also, if you're stuck on your ascension and trying to ascend, I will link to my guide on how to complete the first Trial of the Sekimas. It might take you a couple tries, but I've seen a lot of people commenting how they're stuck on Trials of the Sekimas. They watched my video and they're able to complete it, which makes me really, really happy. So if you're stuck, hopefully it helps you as well. With that said, I would like to get back to playing Path of Exile 2 and leveling up a bit more. So for now, thank you for watching to the end. Since you enjoyed, maybe leave a like while you're down there, share it with a friend who's playing Sork. Of course, after I've leveled a bit more, I'll see you in the next one.